Use headphone for better experience.
Heard first as a whisper and then as a scream, the story began with a child who'd been missing for a month before anyone dialed a phone. Summer in Orlando was heavy with rain and pool water and lies, and by the time the truth tried to speak, the city had learned another language: rumor, glare, and a verdict nobody could carry without shaking. The heat came off the pavement in waves that July 2008, the kind of Florida heat that loosens secrets, but the first one clung tight. 2-year-old Caylee Anthony had not been seen by her grandparents, by neighbors, by anyone who could fix what was already broken. 31 days had gone by. 31 is not just a number when it's measured in bedtime stories missed and bowls of cereal left uneaten. Inside a house on Hope Spring Drive, the calendar had turned into a witness. The call to 911 sounded like confusion trying to put on its shoes. Cindy Anthony, grandmother before anything else, breathless and frantic, reported a car with a smell she could not forgive, a daughter who could not give her straight lines to follow. A granddaughter gone where? The dispatcher asked questions with the calm required by the job, and the answers arrived like puzzle pieces from the wrong box. A child missing a month, a nanny no one could find, a job at a theme park company that did not know the employee who signed the name Casey. Detectives arrived fast. The first hours of any case are greedy, and this one was already starved. They walked through the tidy rooms. The family photographs with their normalcy turned suddenly theatrical. The backyard where an above-ground pool held its bright blue silence. They studied a car, the white Pontiac Sunfire, that smelled in a way sworn to in court later and remembered by anyone who smelled it. Decomposition, they said. A trash bag, a stain in the trunk, a strand of hair that would later be described in lab-sober terms. Same length and color as Caylee's, showing the kind of post-mortem banding some examiners recognize and some contest. In the early days, those details were not yet exhibits. They were notes scribbled into a fresh notebook with the urgency of people who know they will come to read them again and again. Caylee Anthony, 22 and dark-eyed with a quick smile that knew how to place itself just so, told stories that changed like outfits in a suitcase. She worked at Universal Studios, she said, and led detectives down a hallway there, past offices and posters, until she stopped moving and admitted she did not, in fact, work there. She had left Caylee with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez. Zanny, she said, as if a nickname could make a ghost more real. Addresses produced empty apartments or people who had never held the child. Friends used to laughter now watched her words fall apart in their hands. Still, Casey seemed often to float, buoyed by a gravity that did not reach her, smiling at a club, a tattoo inked Bella Vita, beautiful life, on a shoulder that had carried no visible weight in the month that mattered most. Television discovered the case and promptly built a neighborhood on it. Satellite trucks like silver mushrooms sprouting at curbs. Cable hosts practicing outrage until it gleamed. The country learned nicknames for strangers. The tot mom, the boyfriend, the bounty hunter with a hat, the defense attorney with a swagger that suggested he believed the story could be bent into a different shape. Outside the family home, people held signs and shouted, as if volume could solve an equation where a small girl was the missing variable. The law tries to draw a boundary around itself. Cameras keep pushing it outward. At first, the investigation spoke in future tense. We will find her. Teams in fluorescent vests searched woods and retention ponds. The invisible infrastructure of Florida where water and weeds conspire to hide. Volunteers stapled flyers to poles already sun-bleached and tired. Cadaver dogs sniffed through rooms where the scent of detergent lay like denial. A shovel borrowed from a neighbor was written down. Computer forensics arrived with their own hum. Searches for chloroform, for household weapons, for neck breaking. Later there would be arguments about whose fingertips tapped those queries and when, about whether a browser history meant intent or curiosity, whether a line of text on a screen could be a map of the heart. Weeks slid into that Florida fall where afternoons still sweat. In December, a utility worker stepping off the road near the Anthony home, off Suburban Drive, a name that suddenly felt like irony, found bones in a thicket of brush and water and plastic. A tiny skull, duct tape, a small blanket with a pattern someone had chosen for love, not for evidence. The medical examiner would later testify that the duct tape was still at the mandible, that reconstruction placed it over the mouth and nose. The manner of death came back as homicide by undetermined means, a phrase the law uses when the body has more to say than the elements will let it say. To the family, it was an end without the relief of answers. To the city, the case changed tense. Had been missing. Had been found. Arrest shifted to indictment, and indictment to trial. In 2011, the courthouse became a stage where the country practiced watching and disagreeing. The prosecution, led by voices that kept their emotion clipped but audible, told a story about a young mother hungry for the party that resented the gravity of a child, about a trunk that held what it should never hold, about duct tape and a heart-shaped sticker and the odor analysts called unmistakable. They walked the jury through the 31 days as if stepping stones across a river, and every stone, they argued, bore the same muddy print. Casey's. They built an invisible room and asked the jurors to stand in it. Here is Google on a home desktop. Here is a smell in a car. Here is a roll of tape in a house. Here is a child that needed care, and a mother who wanted something else. Freedom. A boyfriend. A night with music loud enough to drown the sound of responsibility. They did not have a cause of death they could draw in a diagram. They had a collage of proof and a faith that the collage would resolve into a picture. Jose Baez, for the defense, took his place and constructed another house out of the same lumber. He said the case began not with murder but with an accident. A child fell into a swimming pool, drowned on a day of inattention, panic, and family trauma. He opened a door most people prefer to leave closed and alleged what had never been reported to police. That past abuse had trained the family to hide shame. He pointed at the state's lack of direct evidence, at contamination and laboratory disagreements, at the subjectivity in a scientist's nose or a dog's alert. He turned the prosecution's duct tape into ambiguity. When placed, by whom, why, though, and asked the jury to read the law's prescription out loud. Beyond a reasonable doubt, he said, is not an opinion poll. It is a wall the state must climb without stumbling. He did not need to tell them what really happened. He only needed to convince them they could not know. Witnesses came and went. Rooms full of strangers learning each other's names for the sake of a child who could no longer speak. Friends who had known Casey's laughter now sat under oath and tried to map their memories onto this new topography. Law enforcement testified from the long desks of procedure, how warrants are typed, how a trunk is opened, how a scent is caught in a small can and taken away like a message in a bottle. A woman with a meter read levels of chloroform in samples, and the words settled somewhere between science and panic in the listening mind. A digital expert tried to explain cache and deleted artifacts, and the way a home computer remembers more than its owner expects. The defense pushed back with its own charts, and calm men and women who explained how browser counts could be errors, how a stain could look like a ghost of something that never was. Every trial breeds its minor characters who nonetheless leave fingerprints on the public memory. A meter reader whose tip was not his first or second but his third became a magnet for suspicion. Why here? Why now? A bounty hunter with a cowboy hat took the stand, and demonstrated how spectacle accretes to a case like Barnacle's. The judge, even tempered and precise, kept the legal road straight, sustaining and overruling with a cadence that soothed and irritated everyone equally. Under everything pulsed the impossibility that the trial was also a funeral, and that the facts and the grief would sometimes sit on opposite benches, impatient for different kinds of answers. Jurors were told to ignore the cameras, to banish television voices, to memorize only the elements of the crimes and the evidence alleged to satisfy them. The city, meanwhile, ran on a separate current. Morning shows and evening hosts tried the case anew every day and reached verdicts that sounded like certainty and felt like weather. Closing arguments arrived like a pair of storms set on the same coordinates. The state returned to its stones across the river and insisted the path was safe. A mother's lies, a child's remains, tape where air should be, searches no one innocent makes, a car no one forgets to clean if it simply contains pizza. The defense lifted up the holes. No eyewitness, no confession, no cause of death, no timeline that could not also serve an accident and a cover-up. He reminded the jury what the law asks them to do, not to choose between narratives like moviegoers, but to acquit, unless the prosecution had built a bridge without gaps. On July 5, 2011, they returned. The courtroom held its breath, the way a place learns to when it knows it will be remembered. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, guilty of 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The sound that followed was not singular. It was the stitched-together noise of a country splitting its response along seams already there. Anger, relief, amazement, a kind of learned despair that the law could be so careful and still land far from where some believed justice sat waiting. Outside, people cried with fury and with sorrow. Inside, the judge said a sentence that amounted to time served for the lies plus probation for unrelated check fraud already resolved. Commentators said all the predictable things, some of them true, some easy, some lazy. The jurors, when finally able to speak, said what jurors in hard cases often say: "We did what the instructions required. We asked for proof we could hold. It did not arrive in the way the charges demanded. That is the architecture of our law. If you dislike the house, change the blueprint." Afterwards, the story branched into the awkward forest called Aftermath, a civil suit filed by a woman named Zenaida Gonzalez, who said her name had been borrowed by the defense's invented nanny and made toxic, moved through courts and died on procedural thorns. Another civil action, from the man who found the remains, floated and sank. Caylee Anthony moved through rooms where she was both notorious and, in time, invisible, working, like many Americans who want to pass under the radar, in places that require quiet and cash and no stage. Years later, she would sit for a camera and, through a new lens, tell a story in which trauma and accusation braided again. Some believed, others did not. The old arguments woke, stretched, resumed. The case had already done its cultural work. It taught millions to speak in evidence and error, to know what a browser cache looks like, to suspect heart-shaped residue where hearts had broken. It trained a generation of detectives to be wary of scent science without corroboration, to treat computer forensics as both microscope and mirage, to remember that a jury cannot be asked to climb a ladder missing 3 rungs. It hardened some hearts and softened others, depending on where you stood when the verdict unfurled. But beyond the screens, the human plot kept its smaller, truer pace. Grandparents learned the art of remembering without fresh tears every day, of setting out a small toy at Christmas without trembling too long. Friends organized quiet remembrances without hashtags, A memorial garden accepted a plaque with a name that will always be younger than the trees that shade it. The neighborhood learned to take a pause when a child's voice rings out and then disappears. Learned to count seconds before calling. Learned to borrow urgency from a past that had spent too much of it on cameras. If you walk the route now, the stretch of suburban Florida where palms comb the sky and storms begin at 4 p.m. like appointments, you can feel the case like a basso continuo under the air. Not a melody anymore, not the hook that once caught every conversation, but the steady note that gives shape to a community's ideas about what vigilance means. A mother loading groceries into a trunk scans her back seat with the care of someone who knows that small neglects can metastasize into myths. A neighbor who hears arguing in a yard does not turn up the television. He steps outside, eyes open, not to accuse but to be present. In a classroom, a teacher writes critical thinking on the board, and, when the lesson turns to media, says, "Remember how sure we felt both ways, and how the rules required more than certainty." The law's story ends where the docket runs out. A judgment entered, a sentence reduced and replaced by time already in a cell. Probation concluded. Civil suits dismissed or settled or abandoned. Appeals decided, petitions denied. But stories like this do not return to silence. They move to lower volumes and settle into habits. Parents install alarms on sliding doors around pools. Grandparents establish rules about phone calls and how long absence must be allowed before phones begin ringing. Reporters remember to rub the glitter off a headline before typing the next paragraph. Detectives write the reminder on a whiteboard. Grief is not proof. Neither is a smile. The science people crawl back into their labs and shore up the edges of their claims. And somewhere, a little memorial to a girl with laughing eyes catches morning light. Sun warms the bronze. Someone has left a small toy, faded by months of weather but still offering its silly smile. A passerby stops, reads the name, does the mental math that never gets easier, this many years since, and then does the most radical act available in a world that turns stories into noise. She stands very still and refuses to make it about herself. In that stillness, the case becomes, finally, a single unbroken line. A child, a summer, a search that should have come sooner, a set of rooms where adults argued about truth and harm, and a country that learned again what its standard requires and what its heart wants. You wanted the story without jumps, without cuts, told straight through until the last light fades. It fades here, softly, not as an acquittal or a condemnation, but as an invitation to remember the smallest piece correctly. That a little girl laughed in a kitchen one June morning, and someone loved that sound, and the world is better when we choose to protect its echo. The evening comes on in Orlando the way it always has. Pink veils over flat water, thunderheads building a city taller than the one on the ground. And the case keeps lowering its voice until only the people who choose to listen can hear it. That lowering is not forgetting. It is a kind of stewardship. After a while, the volume of our sorrow needs to match the size of our usefulness, or else it just roars in place. So the usefulness took shape so ordinary they don't look like memorials unless you tilt your head. A neighborhood association added a line to its newsletter about pool ladders and gate alarms, and the simple discipline of counting, 1, 2, 3, when you cannot see a child. A pediatrician kept a stack of bright postcards at the checkout desk titled, "Watch the Water," each with the phone numbers for swim lessons and a bullet point that says, "The quiet is the dangerous part. Drowning is silent." A church nursery posted a sign that reads, "Two sets of eyes," because redundancy is how bridges keep standing. These are not grand gestures, and that is the point. Safety is not a statue, but a habit. In a small classroom at the police academy, an instructor clicked to a slide with no photos. only 3 sentences. He told recruits that innocence and guilt are answers, but investigation is a question, and the quality of your questions decides which answer you get. He walked them through the case like a map they would never be tested on, and emphasized the corners where impatience lives, where a promising odor test might tempt you to stop checking, where a browser log might seduce you into thinking intent has been captured and preserved like a fly in amber. He urged them to be generous with doubt, without being stingy with compassion. Compassion, he said, is not bias. It's the posture that keeps you from stepping on people while you look for the truth. The jurors, whose names most of us forgot on purpose and a few forgot because the world taught them to, went home and learned how to carry a verdict without letting it colonize the rest of their lives. One discovered she could not sit through a movie in which a courtroom was used as a stage set. The violins felt rude. Another started bringing a notebook to every meeting at work. Habit hardened into muscle, and found, to his quiet amusement, that the practice improved spreadsheets as well as deliberations. When they spoke to cameras after the locks on their silence were lifted, some people accused them of cowardice or naivete or worse. They learned a lesson peculiar to the age of screens, that good faith is almost impossible to prove to strangers who bring their own weather to your front porch. So they stopped trying to prove and went back to the work that had paid their rent before any of this happened. The law does not ask jurors to be heroes. It asks them to be present, and sometimes presence is indistinguishable from exhaustion. Reporters who had camped on sidewalks in folding chairs with their names sharpied on the backs took what they could from the experience and left the rest. One became the kind of journalist who leads with the question, "How do you want to be named here?" when interviewing a grieving person. Another learned to put a paragraph in every big story that admits what we don't know yet. A producer who once loved the pop of a breaking news graphic now keeps a small index card taped to his monitor. Don't make certainty a prop. The defense still
team,
loves the craft
their
of
suits
stitching
long
live
since back
video
from
from
the
the dry
context.
cleaner.
He
Lives
has just
now in the
stopped
permanent
confusing
twilight
speed
that
with
surrounds
care.
any lawyer who won where the public wanted them to lose. Their inboxes carry both thanks and curses, sometimes in the same hour. They still stand up in rooms where a stranger's future sits in a chair and say words the law requires to be said. Police are not holy. Evidence is not perfect. Every charge must be proved. They do not apologize for the architecture they work inside. The architecture may frustrate and protect the same human on different days. That is the bargain. The prosecutors, who presented as if the courtroom were a place where careful building could guarantee approval from the physics of justice, learned how many invisible hands push on a case from the outside. In the long run, some of them will bring a different rhythm to closing arguments, one that spends fewer words on moral temperature and more on the simple, sequential spine of proof. One of them, who could not stand the word closure even before all this, now refuses it entirely, choosing instead to say resolution when the law has done what it can do, and relief when the heart gets one of its rare vacations from pain. The house on Hope Spring Drive, ordinary as a postcard again, sits inside these adjustments like a seed in loam. Grass is cut, packages arrive. A new family may someday look up and wave to a neighbor without knowing anything about headlines. That is not insult. It is a mercy performed by time. When they turn a key in the lock, they will be unlocking a place that once held a table where people cried, and a kitchen where people wrapped their grief in plastic wrap and lived anyway. The walls are allowed to start over even if people are not. If you stand on the sidewalk across from that house at dusk, cicadas will drown your second thoughts, and the air will smell of cut lawns and something sweet that might be a gardenia. You will hear the usual choreography: car doors, a basketball bouncing, someone laughing too loudly into a phone. And then, if you are the sort who listens for the lines beneath the melody, you will notice how many people check the back seat before they pull away. How many front doors are left open just long enough for a small voice inside to be heard? How many neighbors wave not because they are friendly, though they are, but because attention is a kind of safety net, and every strand counts? In the years after, the case keeps stepping onto other stages. A cameo in classrooms where evidence law is taught. A slide in a seminar about forensic chemistry that distinguishes between hypothesis and halo. A footnote in a course on ethics for television producers. It is used by activists who want better resources for missing child protocols, and by librarians who craft digital literacy workshops titled, "Search Results Are Not Facts." The case wears each of these uses without complaint. It doesn't belong to anyone who wants to harvest it for applause. It belongs to the future that might be kinder if we let it be. There are still arguments, some loud, some quiet. At family tables on holidays, a cousin will say, "I'll never believe," and another will lift a hand and answer, "I know, but listen." The listening is the only part that changes people. In the best rooms, one person will say, "I think the state asked us to jump across a missing span," and another will say, "I think those spans are the places where harm hides if we let it," and both will agree on the one sentence that requires no vote. A child was owed a better world. In a park not far away, there is a bench whose plaque refuses to explain itself. It simply offers a name and a year and a line from a children's book about rabbits counting the stars. The bench is the right height for people who are tired, and for adults who want to tie a little shoe. Some afternoons a woman sits there with a brown paper bag and feeds crumbs to birds. She does not speak to anyone. She is doing chaplain work without a collar, keeping company with whatever must be kept company with. It is not dramatic. It is wholly the way mending is holy. Small stitches, invisible from the back row, strong enough to keep the seam from splitting. The case will always be controversial. That word is just Latin for turned against, which is what happens when evidence and expectation face each other in a bright room and neither yields. But controversy is not a destination. It is a weather pattern you pass through on your way to the land where people behave better because they have seen how badly we can fail a child. In that land, you will find a neighbor who texts when your side gate is open. You will find a teenager who looks up from a screen to ask if the toddler he's watching is supposed to be this quiet. You will find a 911 dispatcher who stills the tremor in her own hand by speaking slowly enough to build a bridge between what happened and what can still be saved. Toward the end of any long retelling, the temptation is to produce a sentence that lays a wreath on everything. Resist it. Wreaths are for ceremonies. Life needs instructions, so let the ending be ordinary and exact. Keep keys on a hook by the door so panic wastes fewer seconds. Look people in the eye when they change their stories and ask them to pick one. Write down times. Teach children the names of their guardians and the number they can dial. Tell the truth early, even if it embarrasses you. Make room for grief without letting it consume the entire table. Believe the first alarm bell that rings in your head. Forgive slowly and carefully. Love extravagantly and in public so that indifference never has a place to sit. Night settles. A porch light clicks on. Somewhere a television glows, volume low. The camera trucks moved on years ago, but the light the case cast remains. Dimmer, yes, and better for being dimmer. It illuminates enough to help us pick up what we can carry. A name, a lesson, a promise. You lift them gently and you go inside.